Susanna Black and I, Paul Grenier, will be starting this conversation today. And Susanna and I are with the Simone Weil Center, and we're here also together with our co-host, the Johns Hopkins-Nanjing Center, of which here Adam Webb is our representative and the co-director. So our topic today is, can our post-COVID world not only be adequately safe, but also adequately human? And what we found from this perspective, at least at the Simone Weil Center, is that it tends to be that the question about being adequately safe gets a lot of attention, but there's not a lot of attention given to being adequately human. That doesn't compute as easily as a question. So that's one reason why we brought together this particular group of scholars to join a discussion, which we think can look at both parts of that equation. Anyway, Susanna, would you like to unmute and introduce our team?
Sure. I'm Susanna Black, and the Simone Weil Center's mission is to bring a philosophical perspective to political questions. We like to ask questions about what things are, what they mean, and how to go about thinking about them. So before taking a stab at these questions, I would like to introduce our speakers. Aaron Carietti, Professor of Psychiatry and Human Behavior and Director of the Medical Ethics Program at the University of California, Irvine School of Medicine. We have Adrian Pabst, Professor of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent. He's also the Deputy Director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. D.C. Schindler, Professor of Metaphysics and Anthropology at the John Paul II Institute at the Catholic University of America. And finally, we have Adam K. Webb, Resident Professor of Political Science and co-director of the Hopkins-Nanjing Center in China. And again, thank you very much, Adam, for helping to run this show with us. So, Paul, why don't I turn this back over to you? We've got three sections of sort of broad sections of questions that we're going to be asking. We'll give about 20 minutes to each. At the end, we'll be taking some audience questions, so feel free, as you think of them, to throw those questions into the Q&A. And yeah, we are just very pleased to have you all with us on this, at least Eastern Standard Time, Saturday morning. So, Paul.
Yeah, I'm unmuted, right? Good. So I also just think, as long as we're on the subject of thank yous, that I really want to thank Aaron Cariotti for getting up at what is really an ungodly early hour to join us. We'll have to figure out a way to bring China closer to America, both geographically as well as culturally, and so that we can resolve these issues in future. But yeah, I think it's a good idea to start with looking at not just technologies, but I think that I really think in terms of technology as a way of thinking itself. And I got George Grant is really, I think, the best person to look at. It was actually David, he was your father, David L. Schindler, who first urged me to read George Grant on technology. And I urge everyone as a takeaway from this conversation to try to do that. But it just, when on the one hand, we look through the world through a technological lens, in a sense that we want to, if people are overweight, we look for a pill, or if they have an illness, we look, for a shot, or we look for an app to solve that problem. And I think that one of the problems of the technological is that, we, instead of asking questions about what is good for humans as such, given the nature of human beings, that question seems to get bracketed, and very quickly we go to the question of, what's fastest and what's most convenient, before really necessarily understanding what the question even is. And then very quickly consensus seems to arise about, this is the only way to go, and everything else is sort of off the table, even in terms of a discussion, because it's getting in the way of what's fast and convenient and what's obviously correct. So there's something about the way we think technologically, I think, that forces things into that kind of, those kind of ruts. And I'd like to, this is something that I think that a lot of you could have something interesting to say to, but I'm going to be one of those annoying professors who's going to point out the student right away. And I'm going to ask David if you could maybe start us off on that question, but everyone please join in.
Thank you, Paul. I'll just make one comment. I think people can bring in other dimensions. You mentioned our tendency to think technologically about these problems and characterize that in terms of imagining immediately technological solutions to problems. But I think we also ought to pay close attention to the fact that the technological mediation of our thinking isn't simply in terms of the kinds of responses that we envision. At a more fundamental level, technology mediates our thinking about it. And I think that's one of the things that has become so apparent with this particular pandemic, but you see it in every aspect of our common life these days, is that technology has, the social media in particular, has mediated our way of thinking, and inevitably then also ended up mediating the content of the thinking. It's and it's in a certain sense cultivates a certain habit of soul. If we could talk about our community as having a kind of the soul or spirit, the soul of our community is being profoundly affected by this way of interacting. And I mean, just to give a very quick example, I think we've all come to recognize how quickly we overreact to comments that a person might make on social media. I mean, we scarcely need to point to any evidence there. We're all familiar with that. Or even things like weather events that can be blown out of proportion in preparation because these things are so immediately communicated without context. I think that's a dimension of this problem that needs to be investigated. Anyway, I'd have more things to say, but I want to bring other people.
David, maybe if I could attempt to name what you're describing, just to give a label to it, perhaps scientism would be a helpful word, not science itself, but in fact, a metaphysical attitude that science is the premier or perhaps the only valid form of knowledge. And as you said, this comes along with certain dispositions of soul and habits of thinking and perceiving the world. I think our ability to reason and to ask questions in this framework is instrumentalized. This is where the technological side of things comes to the fore. And this notion that science is the only valid form of knowledge forces us to interpret all human activity, including our response to the pandemic, as kind of technical activity. And I think it narrows our range of vision in terms of asking questions about the kind of life that we want to lead and what is and is not an appropriate response to a public health issue or public health crisis. And just I think historically, this way of thinking has been on the rise, certainly in the United States, probably in Western Europe as well, since the end of the Second World War. It's interesting if you look at some of the early Cold War rhetoric, probably 1945 to 1955-ish, the account of what we were doing in relation to the communist East was a sort of a moral Judeo-Christian West fighting a godless, amoral communist East. And around 1955, the rhetoric shifted to away from that kind of clash of civilizations rhetoric that had transcendent or religious overtones to it, to instead an approach that said, no, we're going to beat the Soviets on the basis of a greater secularity. We're going to sort of readopt Enlightenment values of technology and material well-being and progress and consumerism, sort of framed in material terms, the kind of Young Turks mentality of the 1960s. And I think since then, we've continued to see the growth and progression of this metaphysics, is really what it is, of this account of the world taking over our public life and our public discourse in ways that we probably don't even recognize anymore. If science is elevated to this sort of absolute model of knowledge, then various forms of interiority disappear, various questions disappear. They're sort of just bracketed, or it doesn't even occur to people to ask them anymore. And my own view of the pandemic is not so much that it has shifted our thinking radically, but rather that it's unmasked attitudes that were already there. And in retrospect, one can look back and say, well, our response to the pandemic, such as it has perhaps been entirely predictable given our sort of basic fundamental premises. So my view is that this is not just a political issue, it's a metaphysical problem. It goes all the way down. And COVID was just a sort of especially intense, and then especially sort of acute opportunity to see who we are and what we are, and to get a clearer view of our basic dispositions toward the world and life together in society.
I wanted to follow the science seems to fit in, Aaron, with what you were saying. This sort of
that's exactly right. Follow the science,
great.
Follow the experts is a way not of pointing people to empirical realities that they should be paying attention to or taking into account in their argument. It's actually a way of shutting down conversation, right? Because if you don't qualify, if you don't have the right letters after your name, you're not worth listening to. Your human experience, your own interpretation of things, your attitudes and dispositions don't really count.
And I think there's two problems with, this motto, following the science, which of course has also been the way the UK government has framed its response to the pandemic. One problem has already been alluded to, which is, what about all the other considerations? But even in terms of just science and technology themselves, which bit of science, which bit of evidence, right? Which model? Because of course there's no consensus among scientists about these things at all. So it's even shutting down debate among scientists within the scientific community, never mind, so ruling out of the court of public discussion, other perspectives. So it's a really dangerous way to go. And it also gives the public a false sense of security when actually this is far from clear, far from certain. The first thing I think that we have to do as responsible, citizens, participants in the public realm, politicians, policymakers, and scientists, is to acknowledge the radical uncertainty, right? Is to say that actually we don't know, right? That's the first thing we need to actually start with, to acknowledge our state of ignorance, as it were, and to really dispel this myth that somehow as humans we can just conquer these things. Somehow this is some heroic struggle against a plague thrown at us. This is not the way to go. This is not how it's portrayed in the Bible and other holy texts. These are, first of all, reminders of our finitude, of our mortality, of our frailty. And if we don't start with that, then I think the response is likely to be misguided. And then it's buying into the kind of hubris that somehow technology is a panacea, that science will give us all the answers, that we don't need anything other than data and modeling in order to understand what's happening and then craft a public political response. So this is really all part, I think, of a modern secular mindset that suggests that somehow, man is at the center of all things. Technology and science will give us the answers, and there's a kind of utopia of progress. And it's occasionally sort of slightly set back by events, but the ship of globalization will carry on sailing. progress, you know, the arc of history will still bend in that direction, and really all will be well if only we, you know, we carry on as before. I mean, it is really kind of, you know, a Panglossian sort of politics on steroids, and you know, we can see all of the you know, collateral damage it's now causing. And that's not to say that, you know, I'm against, you know, scientific progress or technology or indeed, you know, vaccination, but I think we need to have this embedded into something much, you know, more conceptually informed by metaphysics, by anthropology, by ethics, by history. Otherwise, we are bound to go wrong.
I have a brief comment to add on that as well. I mean, I think it's not only a question of this sort of Faustian scientific mentality gaining ground. I think it's also symptomatic of the retreat of other kinds of language from public debate about this. I mean, a kind of, if you look at John Rawls and his idea of public reason, the kinds of things that can be legitimately brought into public debate, they're actually quite narrow on any broad sort of world historical view. It's things like, you know, life, safety, economic efficiency, growth, those kinds of things. I mean, the liberal state has great difficulty dealing with these fundamental questions about, you know, human needs and human flourishing. So the resources that we have to talk publicly, you know, together about how to deal with a public health crisis are somewhat impoverished, which is why this kind of scientific or measurable or utilitarian language takes over to fill that space. And this is, I think, why we see, you know, on the left, this talk about kind of their life or survival statistics being the only yardstick, and then on the right we have people talking about, in terms of Homo economicus, about economic growth and the economic costs and the economic utility. There's a whole range of social circuits of meaning and dimensions of human well-being which get short shrift because the modern liberal public sphere has great difficulty talking about things like that. I think there's also a social base or a social dimension to this, right? And if you look at the experience and background of people who are making these kinds of policy decisions. I remember about 20 odd years ago, there was this piece, I think by David Brooks, about the organization kids, right? And these people with fairly narrow aspirations who are socialized in a certain way and you know, safety conscious and risk averse and so on. And I think, you know, as people like that move into early middle age and start making decisions, it's unsurprising that the center of gravity of what they talk about is, you know, some combination of, you know, safety, economic utility, etc. The other language is missing, not only on a philosophical level, but just in terms of social reality and social experience.
That's been a really interesting discussion. With one question, we've used up about half of our time on the technology issue, and I have two more questions to go, but I can't help. But we don't need to go get this. Isn't we're not trying to cover everything we need to this semester. We'll have other conversations, so that's no big deal. I want people to talk as long as they want. This is really good. I just can't help adding, Adrian. I enjoyed hearing your points also about excluded and yet sometimes really eminent voices. I think of someone like Lord Sumption in England, who was like one of the preeminent minds in the country, has long been thought. As far as I know, is his prestige as great as I think? I mean, he was head of the Supreme Court. He's written books on history. He's a brilliant mind, has a completely different take on how to deal with the pandemic. And he's sort of shunted aside because he doesn't have the right sort of technological or scientific credentials, apparently. But in any case, I want to shift gears to geopolitical angle on the technological. And I've mentioned to you guys before that I've been quite fascinated with Giorgio Agamben's take on this from the very beginning. It was our friend Aaron Walker who first pointed him out as an interesting sort of voice, although he was sort of cast aside quickly because he wasn't kind of with the program. But I think that his concerns about our getting too carried away with using the emergency of a health crisis to change the way we look at the political, I think it has turned out to be rather pretty prescient. And most recently, he said that what we're seeing apparently is that because the methods used in China, which used technologies of tracking people, and which, apparently there's some AI coordination of how people move about space in order to control them. And people are looking at this and saying, hey, this is great. They're dealing better with the pandemic. Maybe the model of sort of a communist capitalism, which sort of casts aside our old bourgeois democracy and sort of notions of a state of law without an emergency, giving the central authority, the central sovereign, the power to do what's necessary to keep us all safe in a given instance. So maybe the Chinese model is going to become the new model globally, because of its new prestige. But there's an alternative way is to say, no, let's not blame China for this new technocratic order. It's something that's just simply, it's a new global trend. It's in the air, and it's no more China's than it is Silicon Valley's idea. It's just a global idea whose time has come. But obviously, this is directed towards Adam first. What is the, I guess, who's to blame for the technocratic orders? Is it China, or is it a global trend?
I think I should preface this by saying that this is my personal view rather than as co-director of the Hopkins-Nanjing Center. I think certainly the sense among some circles in China is that what they perceive as China's success in controlling the pandemic within China indicates the superiority of the Chinese model. While other people, I think, may see this as a harbinger of a kind of dystopian global surveillance society. My own view is I don't think Beijing is going to be the center of a dystopian world simply because I think the economic and demographic and political realities within China are likely to frustrate that trajectory sooner or later. But I do think that the kind of technocratic fusion of political and economic authority and the emergence of a surveillance society and the impulse to tame the mass of people, I think that impulse is real. But the most sinister part of that, in my view, is not that impulse prevails among some in Beijing, which should not surprise us, but rather the most sinister part is that elements of it, I think, are resonating with educated and influential people elsewhere in the world who, frankly, should know better. I don't think there's anything distinctly Chinese about that model in any sense. I think large segments of the Chinese population are repelled by it. I think it's a placeless model in the sense that we've seen some of these impulses and tendencies crop up again and again in history in various absolutist regimes with centralized power. And one thing that I think is important to bear in mind is that some of the greatest enthusiasts of centralized power in history have been upwardly mobile people who are educated in narrow ways, often dependent on that centralized power for their status, quite confident in their own enlightenment, quite willing or eager to deploy the power of the state to prod society along some path of progress. So it shouldn't surprise us that the pandemic has seen certain experts in the West singing the praises of a Chinese-style lockdown and closed borders and intrusive monitoring. And as Michel Foucault, I think, rightly noted, when you develop techniques of control in one setting for one purpose, they're very easily transferred to other contexts later on. So ultimately, I think I'm less worried about China as such and more worried about the fact that an important layer of Western society is in a way becoming more Chinese in a placeless sense of that term. And I think one uncomfortable sort of secret of modern educated strata is that for much of the 20th century, they talked about freedom, but when the dust of social change settles, it turns out that often they look a lot more like the functionaries of the old absolutist regimes. They seem much less interested in freedom than in predictable rewards and safe orthodoxies and calculated conformity to power. So perhaps we are at some kind of inflection point where free-for-all in modernity in a way becomes a bit more safety conscious, a bit more comfortable with authority, and a bit darker along the way. So I think it's broader than a Chinese model, but I think it is real.
Yeah, it's interesting how easily people have become comfortable with losing large swaths of freedoms people seem to have just taken for granted, and now just as quickly they take for granted not having those freedoms. It really is, and it deserves a whole conversation of its own. I think the way world that conceived of itself as being freedom being its defining characteristic, very, very quickly seemed to be perfectly happy with just sort of dumping out the baby and the bathwater and the municipal water system at the same time. But did anyone want to add anything to this theme? It may be, or should we move on to another question? David, you look like you have an interest in adding something.
If I we've grown up contrasting liberalism and communism as a sort of an automatic response, and we think of communism as having a kind of totalitarian character, and liberalism as being open and free. But I think one of the things that Agamben's very insightful observation points out, sets into relief, is that these regimes are not quite as different as they seem, and it would take a much broader context to think through exactly why that is. But one observation I think is that Aaron had mentioned recognizing the pandemic as not indicating a new phase of thinking and managing existence, but in fact unmasking what's been there. So we need to go back to the causes, and when we do that, it seems to me we need to go all the way back and recognize that at the base of this is we're seeing the implications of a kind of massive centuries-long experiment in founding human community on something other than the truth, founding human community on something other than a metaphysical and ultimately theological vision of what the human being is. We thought, as so often happens, you try to solve one problem in a kind of technological way, and it ends up creating problems. You might solve that one, but you end up creating other problems. I think similarly, the great Western experiment of a secular society was an attempt to solve the problem of religious pluralism and religious violence and so forth. But what the implication of that was that we established the horizon of our existence together on something other than its actual end and purpose. And the moment we do that, it seems to me that there's going to be set in place a tendency to collapse into a kind of materialism, formalism, sort of technocratic control that on the one hand seems to allow the freedom to embrace all sorts of deeper meanings about reality, but is constantly reinterpreting those as purely private beliefs that have nothing to do with the horizon of existence. And so in the long run, that there seems to be a great difference between that and the kind of totalitarian absolutist sorts of governments of the 20th century, but it's a subtler version of the same thing. And so this extraordinary kind of convergence that we're beginning to see is not really surprising from that perspective.
Yeah. I'd just like to comment a little bit on David's remarks, that I think we're seeing a kind of
we have just a few minutes left. Aaron quickly, and then Adrian was going to add something as well, and then we'll go on to our next theme. Yeah.
I think these things are two sides of the same coin. Again, going back to this idea of a metaphysics of scientism, you develop a totalitarianism of disintegration before you have a totalitarianism of domination. And what I mean by that is think about the term social distancing. It's a very strange term. It's not a medical term at all. A medical term might be physical distancing, but the idea of social distancing is one that suggests that all of us should behave more and more like atomized, disconnected individuals, in order to perhaps be more easily manipulated as little pieces within a model. And the models of science in some ways have become more real than reality. We sacrifice real, tangible, known human goods that we can't quantify, like burying the dead, for the sake of abstract, theoretical, potential goods like, well, we don't know if dead bodies can transmit COVID, so just in case, we're going to burn them and not allow families to take them home from the hospital. I remember having a conversation with a family. I'm an ethics consultant at her hospital, and helping them accept the idea that their loved one was dying of this illness was very, very difficult. But they were even more devastated when they learned that the Center for Disease Control wouldn't let them come retrieve the body and have a burial, which was very important for them. But instead that they would be given the ashes after the fact. And so, I mean, this is just one example of, I think, the sort of totalitarian conception of science, where this is the only thing that's allowed to be given any consideration. And that whole premise itself is not rational. It's not a conclusion of science, first of all. So it has to be put forward as simply a resolution of the will, right? It just must be this way. And if you raise your hand and ask any questions, then you are placing yourself outside of polite company, and you're going to be set aside. Oh, that's a very totalitarian notion, right? I think it was Vogelin who said the characteristic feature of all totalitarianisms is the inability to ask certain questions, right? And it's striking to me how far down that road we've gone. And it doesn't matter whether it's China or the United States. I think we're seeing that sort of trend play out in both social spaces.
We're all going to be canceled, Aaron. I think that's evident. But Adrian, quickly, let's. I want, even though we're over time on this segment, but this has been really valuable, so I don't regret it at all. But Adrian, please add something you wanted following what David had mentioned earlier. And then Susanna, you jump in with our next segment.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And really, two thoughts very briefly, if I may. One is, of course, I think Agamben, like others before him, have rightly diagnosed the sort of latent threats, involved in sort of modern logics around exception and in sort of establishing a whole system of social control and surveillance when exceptional events happen. 9/11, the pandemic. Before that, we might say the war on drugs, the war on poverty. I mean, there's all sorts of precedents in modern history when the state has really arrogated to itself, new powers. And I think we have to be rightly very skeptical and critical when that happens. And at the same time, I think there's a slight danger that, the likes of Agamben may be guilty of the sort of determinism they denounce, because they now somehow seem to say that this is inevitable. This is always going to happen. And we've got no, as it were, choice. And I think that's when history is far, far more contingent, that we should realize that even in a pandemic where we can save lives initially by doing the things that are put in place, that doesn't mean that we have to give up on our freedom permanently. So I think contingency is really important here. Agency is really important. We must not lose sight of that. And I'm sometimes worried that the arguments that, people like Agamben develop are, as I said, guilty of the same determinism that they otherwise denounce. And I think we need to be aware of that. The other point I was going to make is, for all the differences between the West, or the Western model and the Chinese model, and there are still significant differences in terms of personal liberties and so on, there are some very worrying shared tendencies. And one is, I think, when you just start with the idea that somehow unlimited freedom will only ever produce more unlimited freedom. You know, so the Chinese system sort of adopted capitalism, and then many in the West thought, well, you know, capitalism will be followed by liberal democracy. That is the way it always goes, right? Well, no, it doesn't. You know, capitalism is compatible with all sorts of different political systems, as we of course know. And then the same thing is true in the West. It's not because you've got certain, economic forms of organization that somehow things won't go in another way. I mean, after all, it was Dostoevsky who first really made this very clear. He said, you know, when you start with unlimited freedom, you end in unlimited tyranny. You know, so the question really that arises, what sort of freedom are we talking about? If it's the Western conception of negative liberty, you know, freedom from constraints, except for, you know, your private conscience and the law, then of course you are going to end up in some form of, tyranny, which is the tyranny either of individual choice, where you never ask about the conditions in which choice is exercised, or even worse, you know, behind infinite choice stands some form of capitalism that actually precludes all sort of possibilities. And I think in the Chinese case, it's probably because freedoms were only economic that, you know, the whole infrastructure of social control can proceed, because there was never any sense of genuine political freedom. And where that's happened in China, in the case of Hong Kong, it's being rolled back. So, you know, the temptations, the totalitarian temptations have been there. And unfortunately, events like the pandemic have brought out, I think, some of the worst aspects of the two models. But ultimately, there is a danger that forms of liberalism and forms of authoritarianism end up converging. And I think we need to be very careful as to how we can then carve out a space in which alternatives to both can really take root. And I think that's what a lot of our, you know, conversations, I think, are now about.
Thanks so much, Adrian. Just a quick reminder, if you've got any questions, please feel free to just drop them in the Q&A. We will get to them at the end. We'd love to have just a little bit of conversation right at the end there. Okay, so we're now going to sort of turn to a broader question or a broader sort of topic, considering what we mean by well-being when in the context of the pandemic. And I'm going to be a little bit of a contrarian in this. Paul and Adam, in the sort of notes about what this conference was going to, or this conversation was going to be focusing on, wrote that, quote, "The dawn of COVID-19 appears to have brought about a sea change. Well-being has now become more unidimensional, with many policymakers urging us to view it exclusively in terms of the biological safety of human bodies." As we've talked about already this morning, surely that's wrong, but at the same time, the protection of bare life is in fact a good. Those of us who are skeptical that abortion is morally permissible do so in part, although not entirely, based on the idea that the bare life of the child should not be taken, even if hypothetically that would lead to sort of the flourishing into freedom of the mother, because our freedom shouldn't be bought at the expense of the lives of others. So if we believe that the nature of politics is the experience of the common good, how is it not the case that sort of the fact of contagion even is a physical instantiation of that truth? A lot of us at the Simone Weil Center had long been uneasy about the insistence on autonomy and bare freedom, as it were, as the measures of the good. So I guess what I'd like to ask you guys is there a way to use the occasion of COVID to put our money where our mouths are in terms of taking action with our bodies, and, you know, which includes social distancing, as creepy as that phrase is, to promote the physical survival of our neighbors as an act of love? Is there a way to think of this protection that we can give to each other as a way of giving justice to each other? There's, you know, Deuteronomy 22 has a little section about where it's like a little mini building code. When you build a new house, you have to make a parapet around your roof so that you may not bring the guilt of bloodshed on your house if someone falls off the roof. You know, that's not safetyism. That's sort of decent forethought and concern for the safety of others. So how can we use this as an occasion to think in those sort of common good terms without falling prey to safetyism, I guess is the question.
I'd like to comment on addressing that question. I mean, I think there are a range of legitimate judgments one can make on, risk and policy responses in the pandemic. I mean, personally, I do happen to think that this is a serious enough public health danger to warrant certain measures to contain it. I mean, I maybe somewhat OCD. I actually wash all my shopping with soap and water and so on. I think that any sort of definition of government's role in public power, there are certain public health measures which are quite legitimate. At the same time, I think one can be deeply uneasy both with how arbitrary some of those measures are and, as we were talking about, the level of comfort with exercising very intrusive forms of power that set a dangerous precedent. And I think one of the issues here is what this understanding of freedom is that one is protecting. I think on the one hand, on the left, you have this kind of view of freedom as bare life. On the right, you have this idea of a kind of masculine sort of caricatured physical self-assertion by people in the prime of life who are economically active as agents in the economy, and this will only kill the old and the weak and so on. And both of these are very sort of atomistic physical understandings of liberty. And I think what is neglected is maybe an older or more traditional understanding of liberty as these sort of interlaced human engagements with different spheres of activity, whether it's family, faith, civil society, vocation, etc. And I think all of those things require a more multidimensional understanding of the space that people need to do these things. One can certainly target public health measures in a legitimate way, focusing narrowly on contagion, density, actual risk in that way, while still not allowing the state to encroach unnecessarily beyond that threshold, or crucially allowing the state to pick and choose which activities of equal density or equal risk are more or less worth protecting. So I think one can take the public health dimension seriously in a narrow and targeted way, but still be very concerned about overreach and the precedents and the logic that are involved in that.
And I think this also requires the ability to see other competing human goods at work, rather than, I mean, scientific models like to work with one variable and to isolate and control every other variable. That's how the method works. It's a useful method for some things, but we can easily develop a kind of monomania for bringing the risk down to zero. And you hear some of this rhetoric, like it's intolerable if one more person dies of this virus, then we haven't done our job in keeping you safe. And this is a form of insanity, really. And I mean, I've done a lot of work looking at worst case scenarios. I helped my university, helped the state of California develop ventilator triage guidelines. So I spent many months thinking through, what if the hospital system gets overwhelmed? What's that going to look like? So I understand the dangers of a too tepid response, but at the same time, I like pointing out to people that we don't live our lives this way in a sort of zero risk fashion in other contexts at all. And it doesn't mean that we're accepting or embracing death as a good or acceptable thing for our fellow citizens or our neighbor. And I mean, one simple example is, we know that a certain number of people are going to die in California, let's say, every year in motor vehicle accidents. And we know that we could save all of those lives. We know with pretty definitive statistical certainty that we could save all of those lives with some public policy changes. All we would have to do is lower the speed limit to 10 miles an hour, or I don't know, 15 kilometers per hour for those of you across the Atlantic, on all of the highways, all of the roads in California, and we would save those lives. The fact that we don't do that, does that mean that we're okay with all of that death and destruction? No, it just means that we recognize there are competing social goods at work here, and focusing on one, which is safety on the road, to the exclusion of others, which is, could be ease of transportation and all kinds of other social goods that would be sacrificed, is not a reasonable or prudent thing to do. But I think our ability to reason this way and be prudent has been impoverished, again, by some of the underlying deep metaphysical assumptions that we have more and more embraced in the last several decades. And I think we need to find our way out of that in order to expand our our breadth of vision and come to a more balanced public policy.
I think that's, you're muted, Susanna.
Sorry, carry on, Adrian, sorry.
Yeah, just very briefly to say, on the one hand, I think what's been interesting about the response to the pandemic is actually to, move us beyond just pure economic efficiency, a productive function economy, and basically to actually take stock and think, okay, what else matters here? And lives matter, all lives matter, Black lives matter, all lives. And the fact is, actually putting lives above the economy in some ways is, I think, the right instinct, because it suggests that there's something, precious, sacred indeed, about life. And saving lives is not just a utilitarian calculation. It's far, far more than that. So I think that the sort of sanctity of life has actually sort of resurfaced in public debates. And I think that's been has been hopeful, as indeed has been the outpouring of communal solidarity. In every street, in every neighborhood, people have really tried to look out for the people who've been completely abandoned, right? The lonely, the elderly, the sick, the unemployed, the poor. They've actually, resurfaced again in our public consciousness a lot more. The key workers, those who actually put their lives on the front line all the time for us, because they're out there doing dangerous jobs, even outside the context of a pandemic. There are lots of dangerous jobs key workers do that we, have barely talked about and recognized. So I think there's been a lot of good responses. The trouble is, of course, the moment you then get into this rhetoric and discourse around it's all about safety, we can't take any risks, oh my God, if someone else dies from COVID, we failed in our duty. I mean, this is, of course, in taking this to a whole level of sort of hysteric extremes. But some of the fundamental, I think, sort of instinctive responses have shown that we have not yet got to the point, thankfully, and thank God, where we've changed human nature, human thinking, to the point where we can no longer recognize some of those essential goods, like the sanctity of life. So, I'm still hopeful about our initial response, and certainly about the first lockdown, where I think a lot of very, very good things happened that I think suggest that people would like us to have a different economic model, a different political model, put again love and fraternity and friendship at the heart of our politics and our culture. The problem is that those, instincts have not, or those reactions have been superseded by, all the things we've already discussed, the technological response, the main political response, right, the public health response. So it's how you then change the balance of power, right, away from those dominant forces, capitalism, statism, right, and sort of unmediated technology and science, towards, the fraternal, the social, the primacy of love. And I think it's until we've got the right institutions and relationships then that allow us to do that, that we are going to always think of this as a missed opportunity, and that would really be tragic.
I want to echo what everyone is saying here about affirming the sanctity of life, but then also recognizing the complex of goods that constitute life. I mean, and those are not incompatible. And there certainly has been some extraordinary signs of hope, in the sense of the concern that people show for each other. I heard an interview with a woman last night who was taking care of the homeless living under the bridge here in DC. And these kinds of things are remarkable. For me, though, the question that persists is, it's one thing to direct our affections to recognize the importance of caring for others. That's absolutely essential, and this has been an opportunity to reawaken some of those things. But it seems to me that we there's an essential dimension, which is to change our thinking, our conceptions, deepen our understanding of things, and that I think has been far less hopeful. I mean, it's extraordinary. The policies have all been around, for example, essential activities, and you would think that in devising policies regarding essential activities, that there would be a question raised about, you know, what is essential. I mean, the moment you put it that way, what is essential to human existence? I mean, that's a fundamental question. And the problem is we have not yet recognized that it is the case that that, you know, that's a metaphysical theological question, but that has an institutional dimension. That it's not that we are afraid of asking metaphysical questions. I think that's in part the case, but we are reluctant to recognize that metaphysical questions get institutionalized in our public order in a way that requires some real reflection. The reason that that's crucial is that it seems to me that there's always going to be a kind of a reflection. You know, that Plato was right. Plato was right about just about everything, actually. But one of those many things he was right about is that the polis, the city, is the soul writ large. And there's when we limit the horizon of our political order, we're actually limiting the horizon of our individual souls. These reflect. And the reason that's very important in this context is that with the creeping kind of technologies of control and surveillance and so forth that we're all witnessing, our tendency is to want to reduce government control even further to get it sort of out of these human goods. And it's understandable why we would think that way, but it's a devil's bargain. There's a trap in that, because what we end up doing is conceding that government is about control and power principally, and then trying to limit it, and that actually then implies a kind of conception of human nature that we all then unconsciously end up subscribing to, that leads to all these other problems. So I mean, all that I'm getting sort of abstract, but it seems to me that to bring it back to a nutshell is that we have to recall that political order actually has something to do with the meaning of life, and that we need to address these particular questions in that context, or we're going to end up in all sorts of ways reinforcing the very problems that are facing us.
Right, and the last year has shown several telling examples of that, David, what you just described. Even if we only restrict our view to mortality numbers, 2019 saw an increase in deaths in the United States of people with Alzheimer's disease. And they were not dying of COVID, right? These were people in nursing homes that we were doing our best to protect. All these measures were in place because they were very, very high risk individuals. But it turns out that social isolation also kills people. And we know that we can't reverse the effects of Alzheimer's, but there are some things we can do to slow the progression of the illness. And social stimulation and interaction with other people is one of the most robust protective factors to slow the protection of the illness. So there's a sort of two-edged sword at work there. Social isolation has led to an increase of deaths of despair, deaths by suicide, alcohol, and drug overdose in 2019, because it's not good for men to be alone. We're not built that way.
Could I just add one? It's not just, yeah. Just one little comment. It's not just isolation. It's touch, actually. I mean, we know that if you're not touched by other human beings, that your immune system degenerates, and that's not just because of communicating diseases to each other. It has to do with something more fundamental. Sorry.
One of the worst forms of torture we can inflict on another human being is to put them in solitary confinement. That people physically and mentally fall apart when they spend too long in solitary confinement. You become psychotic. You start to hallucinate. Your health goes down the drain.
That explains a lot about the way I feel lately, Aaron.
Many of us.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for those reflections. So I do want to say that in the aftertime, as we say, Simone Weil Center is committed to renewing in-person sort of conferences and hangouts. And I think that one of the things that I am seriously thinking about is that I think probably for a lot of us in our various institutions, we're going to be faced with the choice about whether to continue this kind of Zoom-based life or go back to the less convenient, more expensive, in-person interactions. And I think one thing that we can commit to, ought to commit to, is actually physically being with each other, even though it's going to be, even though we've gotten used to not paying for airfare and not paying for, restaurant meals and so on. So the very noble practice of like going to restaurants and going to conferences and drinking, mediocre white wine out of little plastic cups, I think that I would like to invite all of you to just recommit to that noble sort of aesthetic practice. And meanwhile, I'd like to turn this last bit over to Paul for another about, 10 minutes or so conversation between the panelists, and then we're going to be going to Q&A for the last 20 minutes or so. So Paul, go for it.
Okay, I successfully muted. Yes, this was intentional to really start with how we think about the pandemic. That seemed to be the appropriate approach for our center, which is called the Simone Weil Center for Political Philosophy, with the stress on the word philosophy. Definitely. So we want to start with, what is the pandemic? What are these things? What is a human being? What is human health? And then to get to okay, now what do we do? But we do want to spend some time on the kind of the what do we do question. And this is actually when Adam first suggested the idea for this conference, and it was his idea, and I'm really glad that he came up with it. He recognized that there were certain things that have happened over the course of this year, which go everything from the closures, sometimes apparently arbitrary closures of one type of store as opposed to another type of store, and the people could flock to a big chain store, but the little mom and pop store across the street, for some reason they can't go to for a certain period of time. These issues of tracking and abuses of AI or abuses of sort of biological digital impositions on the human person that may be far-fetched or maybe not so far-fetched. We're not really sure, or having to have vaccine passports before you can move across the border. These strike me, I think that probably several of us, as being dystopian possibilities that we'd like to try to see not happen. If they're conspiratorial ideas, then that's all the better. Then we can say, well, then let's just write a law making sure that those far-fetched things never do happen. But maybe just quickly, I don't think this will take much time. I mean, am I right in assuming that all of us agree that these types of developments are dystopian and are things that should be avoided?
I think one point I'd make here is when we're looking at lessons from coming out of this crisis, I think one of the lessons that people often attempted to draw is that this shows the need for more state capacity, stronger state capacity, giving policymakers a full range of tools to prod people to behave in certain ways whenever the next crisis comes on the agenda. And I think there are things one can do in terms of testing capacity, the ability to scale up vaccine production quickly, and other things which probably could come usefully out of this. But I think that the main lesson at an institutional level should actually be about how narrow those tools really are. I mean, we should be thinking more about taking away tools for the future rather than inuring ourselves to a comfort with power being exercised in this way. And I think there is room over the next 5 years or so to forestall some of these dystopian imaginings that you mentioned. I mean, you could imagine a kind of post-COVID sort of global liberty manifesto, as it were. I mean, if you look at within countries at constitutional provisions, potentially in international treaties, and there are ways of enshrining certain basic liberties, and you can recognize the legitimate government interest in public health, but then circumscribe it quite narrowly. There are dystopian imaginings, as you mentioned, about everything from invasive monitoring to vaccine passports to microchip implants and so on. I mean, I think probably in 2021, some of those things sound a bit exaggerated and far-fetched, but it's certainly possible to imagine within a generation we could be looking at things like microchipping people for their own good. And what better time to rule those things out, to take away those tools by locking in certain constitutional and treaty commitments than now, precisely when they do seem outlandish. I think any measures that you take in a public health crisis should have a much higher and clearer legal threshold of justification, so you don't have the state picking and choosing among activities of equal risk. You can recognize a risk and contagion and you can deal with it in a targeted way, but when the state gets to picking and choosing among spheres of life what is important and what is not, when you have border restrictions which often bear a better loose relationship to different infection rates in different territories, or you allow citizens of certain countries to travel to certain places whereas other people don't. I mean, human beings carry contagion regardless of who they are, or they don't carry contagion regardless of who they are. So I think more consistency, a clearer, higher legal threshold in the sense of proportionality are things that really should be on the agenda, to take tools away rather than to lock them in.
And I think we need to think about this also in not just in relation to the state, but it seems to me that a lot of the gatekeepers for things like vaccine passports are not necessarily going to be, the state that issues me my visa, but it's going to be private actors and global private corporations that are enforcing these sorts of things and acting as the gatekeepers. It will be the airline that asks if I've been vaccinated, right? Not the State Department. It will be the store that I want to shop at, or my employer. And so to get access to the market or to employment or to transportation may require something that is not mandated by the state, but is rather mandated by private actors, in many cases, large globalized corporations. So how can we restrain those? Just one anecdote. I'm with my family on Thanksgiving, contrary to our governor's orders. Sitting around with my in-laws, and I get a text on my phone from my private health insurer, Kaiser Permanente, which is big out here in California. And it was a reminder for me not to get together with my family on this American holiday. And then there was a hashtag, the hashtag "Don't Share Your Air" was the meme or the recommendation. And I actually started wondering how it was even possible for me not to share my air. I mean, this struck me as a very weird form of newspeak, like right out of an Orwell novel, 2 legs bad, 4 legs good sort of thing. But it wasn't coming to me from the state of California or from the federal government. It was coming to me from a private health insurance company. So I think that the political and social question has to do not just with restraining overbearing or overly intrusive surveillance powers of the state. That's an important question, but the ways in which some of these private actors are now exercising undue forms of social control as well, and how do we restrain those manifestations of the same kind of problem?
And of course, when state institutions and those organizations like say tech platforms or others then collude, and of course that's really, I think, the situation we're in, right? We already live in either market states where what we mean by the state has been largely defined by the relationship to the market rather than the nation or other categories on the one hand in the West, all kind of state markets as in in the sort of emerging economies on the other hand. But either way, it's state and market converging and colluding at the expense of society, at the expense of all the you know, not just individual citizens and persons, but also all the intermediate institutions that should mediate, right, between persons on the one hand and state and market institutions on the other. And of course, the work by people like Shoshana Zuboff on surveillance capitalism, I think, is very apposite here, because we are already living in this surveillance capitalism. And as we said, in the case of China and other countries, it's more driven by the state. But either way, it is a form of surveillance and social control. There's no doubt about it. The question is, how do we reclaim not just freedom, but also fraternity, solidarity? And then how do we start, you know, to coin a phrase, you know, taking back control? You know, do we have to break them up? Is it enough to regulate them? You know, how do we really support and protect privacy without necessarily buying into a kind of ultra-liberal idea of, you know, the private is completely separate from the public, which it isn't and ought not to be. But, you know, going back to David's point about Plato, it's precisely the mediation of the individual soul and the polis and indeed the cosmos. That's the question here. So how do we bring about more mediated relationships? How do we bring about institutions that protect, but also give us agency? I mean, I do think that the backlash against market fundamentalism has been important, not just in the pandemic, but before, and that a more protective state, you know, compared with a state that's completely surrendered to the market is on balance better. But absolutely, the dangers of a protective activist state are very clear. And the problem is what's always missing is the person and all the other institutions.
That's that was quite an interesting and challenging discussion. I mean, on the one hand, this may seem flippant, but I think that insisting on reopening pubs seems like the place to start. And I don't and going to them as well. I mean, the idea that, I mean, the pub, I heard this actually incredibly recently, that the pub apparently is short for public place. It's a place where people get together. And the fact that all of these places have been closed, I think, is really ominous. But to be less flippant, I mean, given what you've said, Adrian and David and everyone, I think I've heard a lot of common themes here. I mean, who are the actors? Who are the groups that can take these ideas? I mean, I think a lot of people intuitively would recognize that the primacy, sort of the original goodness of fraternity and of a sense of human well-being and camaraderie that goes beyond just the individual in the marketplace or just the power relationship with the state. I mean, this is not that difficult for people to grasp. But who are the institutions left now, today that we can try to bring together in order to move to the step of actually doing something? Because Adrian, you just set forth kind of a policy agenda, interpreting the more abstract ideas in a more of a policy vein. Is it? I really feel that this is a terrible conundrum. It's not obvious to me who we turn to. Does anyone? I think everyone is just as stumped as I am.
Well, Paul, to say that absolutely. Pub stands for public house, and it was very much this idea that you would be helping to build a convivial society, right? By drinking and eating and talking and maybe playing music or singing along or playing a board game or whatever it was. So it's very much part of what it is to have a rich public realm. Of course, people talk about civil society, but the danger always with that is that civil society is seen as separate from state and market. No, society is more fundamental, and state and market institutions should be, ideally embedded in social relations. And that's, of course, the huge task in front of us. How do you do that, given that state and market are so overbearing, and so many other institutions have been either destroyed altogether or hollowed out in terms of their meaning or their agency? Where do we, who do we turn to? I think it's exactly the question to ask, and I think the answer is really difficult. 50 years ago, so we might have thought, the churches, the universities, professional associations, the local community, the town hall, they were a number of institutions that were more vibrant. And I'm not suggesting 50 years ago was a golden age, or 100 years ago, or the Middle Ages, or antiquity. I mean, I agree with David entirely that Plato got practically everything wrong, maybe except for the pre-existence of matter, but that's not.
Right.
No, sorry that Plato got practically everything right, except he might have been wrong on the pre-existence of matter, but that's that's not such a big question. Obviously, matter can't pre-exist form, and obviously matter has to be created. But that I think we probably agree on that too. But because there's never a golden age to turn back to, and never a time when you can say things, were so much better that it's just a matter of imitating it now. Today, I think there is that question. So on the one hand, all institutions are in crisis, including the churches, the universities, the professional associations, the town hall, and, everything we used to rely upon. On the other hand, extraordinary things are happening. As we said, even creating a WhatsApp group is better than just being completely alienated, isolated, and atomized, right? So there are hopeful signs, as we've already said. And then there's Pope, Benedict's point about creative minorities. Change will never come from majorities and from the masses per se. They will come from small groups that do something, lead by example, and that will then catch on. People will imitate it because it's the right thing to do. So the power of example is an important thing to bear in mind. And of course, Joe Biden didn't invent that phrase, but that's the sort of language that I think may resonate. That it's not the example of power that people are impressed by; it's the power of example. It is an interesting, I think, turn of phrase, and says something, important and worthwhile. But how we recreate forms of collective agency that aren't sort of linked to the central state, I think that's going to be one of the key tasks for us going forward. The churches are and ought to be at the heart of it, but I do also worry about a lack of good church leadership. I really do. And that means, what about the laity, and how do we make sure there's a good balance between clerical authority and lay participation and leadership? And, we don't have very good answers to these questions, I don't think.
I think there are some natural constituencies for this kind of agenda that they need piecing together. And often it is strange bedfellows. I mean, just to take one example, I think a lot of the people in various countries, including in the US, who were bridling at the idea of wearing masks in public and saw this as an encroachment on liberty, were probably not getting very exercised about the fact that the US closed its borders to international travel from certain directions, right? So, I mean, there are these kinds of strange alliances. I think if one can frame this as, looking forward constructively, not just bridling at restrictions, but actually thinking about, where you want the world, or where one wants one's own country to be 30 or 40 years down the road, in terms of what the tools are that policymakers do and do not have at their disposal. I think there's a geopolitical dimension to this as well. I mean, the West has become quite inarticulate at offering an alternative vision of liberty superior to the Chinese model. I think that can be part of the conversation. I think in large parts of the global South, people have not had their voices really part of this debate over sort of lockdown versus other kinds of human goods. But I think a large part of the global South also has people who, instinctively are more sympathetic to the claims of society and the claims of either state or market, and who I think also are suspicious of machinations of power. So I think there are various constituencies that could be pulled together around the idea of forestalling worse things happening, or at least not setting a precedent coming out of this.
I think I'm going to hand the microphone to Susanna in just a second, but I just want to thank all of you for in a short period of time going into great depth on this issue. That idea of turning to the global South, Adam, I think is quite interesting one, as well as a constituency that we tend to overlook just out of habit. Of always just thinking in terms of the transatlantic relationship. It's also a sign of hope to me that in my friends who have kids in Russia, and in universities there, they're going back to in-person schooling, and there seems to be a spirit of conviviality that's a deep part of Russian culture, regardless of what the state says. People insist on getting together, and I think that's a resource to have in mind as well. But we're running out of time, and Susanna's going to take us through some Q&A. And thank you so much again, all of you.
Thank you so much. And thanks again to the audience members. We will be sending out a kind of post-conference email that will tell you more about the Simone Weil Center and I think also about the Hopkins-Nanjing Center. So look out for that. And we will also be sending out to this group of people notices about future events, of which there will be many and in person. Okay, so why don't we turn to, there are a couple of great questions here. This one is from Thais, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, Lopez. When talking about the sanctity of life, there hasn't been much public attention drawn to the process of grief at a time when whole communities and nations are dealing with thousands of lives lost. How should we be talking collectively about dealing with grief, which is such an essential human experience? And how should we be promoting the understanding that people need to be allowed to mourn as communities in the social realm and not just as individuals? And I will open that up to any of you guys.
The tragedy of the ancient story of Antigone hinges on this conflict between this young woman who wants to bury her brother and who senses intuitively very, very deeply within her that this is something I simply can't not do, in spite of the directive of the king that the enemy soldiers in this civil war are not to receive a burial. So I want to go back to that point I made earlier about state directives not permitting funeral rites, or at least the types of funeral rites that that many people would like to have. And this seems to me one place that populations could put a stake in the ground, as Antigone did, and say, no, this is something that we simply can't not do. Lost a friend to suicide during the pandemic. This is a young man, 17 years old. His parents were very good friends of mine. He grew up very close to one of my kids. So this is a young man that I've known since he was an infant. He struggled with depression. The lockdowns contributed to that, certainly, and tragically ended up taking his own life. And I remember just being with his parents after he died, and his mother looking at me and saying, I don't want a COVID funeral, meaning I don't want a small gathering with just a handful of people in some place where family and friends cannot convene. And so we took reasonable precautions, and we found a place where people could be physically distanced outside. But we had a funeral, and 900 people showed up, which was extraordinary and necessary for the community that was grieving the loss of this young man. And so there is a time, I mean, we have a tradition in the United States of civil disobedience, and there is a time where if the state becomes overbearing in its directives, people have to be able to stand up and say, no, this is something that we can't not do.
If no one else wants to weigh in on that one, I actually have I'd kind of like to invite any of you to ask each other questions. We do have a couple of other questions from the audience, but are there any questions that any one of you would like to direct at any others in particular? And if not, we can move on to more audience questions. All right, why don't we do that? Okay, so we've got, this is from Millie Main. Much of the response to coronavirus discerned by professionals and technocrats is based on forms of quantitative measurement and analysis. How can we maintain our humanity when so many of the things that characterize and sustain it are unmeasurable? So, yeah, that sort of seems to be getting at quite a bit of what we've been talking about already today.
One point I would make is that this is partly a question of dispersion of power in different spheres. And I think if you borrow Abraham Kuyper's language of sphere sovereignty, the idea that different human pursuits or different spheres of life have their own sort of not only intrinsic sort of foundational value in terms of what they contribute to human fulfillment, but also have a kind of natural sovereignty that the state and other institutions should not encroach upon. I think given that a lot of the dimensions of humanity that I think that question is talking about actually are manifest within different institutions and social spaces in society, I think in order for those goods to be given their due weight and vigorously defended on an institutional level, this partly comes down to the dispersion of power into those different spheres, into those different institutions. And I think one of the problems with late modern society is that so much has been hoovered up from these diverse social spaces into the public sphere, an undifferentiated public sphere. So I think this is partly a question of power, and I think Bertrand de Jouvenel actually made the point that it's these ramparts defending spaces in society which are an important part of any constitutional order, not only legally, but also in terms of social experience and lived values.
It seems to me another dimension of that. The question touches on something Paul's right. I mean, this is these things are at the heart of what we've been discussing. But one way to characterize the issue is a kind of a creeping abstraction. I mean, we've it's a culture of abstraction, and we remove parts from wholes, and we absolutize that and try to take control. And the quantifying of our study of nature is one example of that. We think that's the best way to understand nature. I mean, it's certainly a dimension of our understanding of nature, but it changes if we make it the best way we understand nature. It changes the nature of things and the very meaning of nature. If abstraction is part of the essential problem, then concreteness becomes a really crucial part of the response. And I was thinking, Aaron was describing this grieving through a funeral. I mean, how concrete a funeral is. This philosopher of technology, Albert Borgman, coined a phrase, a concept that I think is really helpful. He speaks of focal practices. And by focal, he means he's getting at the etymological root of the word focus, which is the fireplace, the hearth. And the insight in his concept there is that you think about how the experience of a household changes when you move from the hearth being the center and the place not only where you cook, but where you have it's the center of heat. It's then going to be a place where people gather. It's something real. When that disappears and you have baseboard heating, suddenly you've lost a thing, a concrete, real thing that gathers people together, and you're encouraging a kind of a pattern of dispersion. And it seems to me, I mean, that notion of focal practices, recovering focal practices, and maybe put that even more concretely, recovering just an attentiveness to things will, in this much more subtle way, I think, can help open up our imaginations and filling our imaginations in ways that may bring out different kinds of approaches on the more general sort of policy level. So it's a matter of returning to the concrete, to put it very simply.
And democratizing rationality, that rationality is not the province of experts or people with certain technological training or people that can build a certain model to supposedly tell us all that we need to know about reality. That Antigone's instinct or my friend's instinct that I need to honor my son in some way, in his life in some way, that is it's deeply important that people feel and know that we have a shared universal rationality that is not simply the domain of the experts, and to to rule their intuitions or their reasoning or their conclusions out of court is, again, it's a form of totalitarian control that I think we should absolutely reject.
Could I, am I allowed to weigh in here? Susanna, do we have to? Yeah, but this idea about the returning to the concrete and into the particular, I think is also a window into also understanding the theoretical at the same time. They go together. The image that I've been toying with all day is something that I got from an essay that David wrote, I think 10 years ago, where he quoted Chesterton's story about what's wrong with the world. And there's a terrific quote there about how he starts with the thesis that little girls should have long hair. And you remember that, of course, David. It's such a terrific passage. And in the context was that there's lice or some sort of illness that kids in slums are getting, and so they're chopping off all of their hair. And so the little girls are going bald. And to me, it seems sort of like when I look at children everywhere wearing masks, I think of the same image of like, well, we have to protect kids from lice, so we'll cut off their hair, and we have to protect children from this illness, so we'll put masks on all of them indefinitely. And it just seems to me that this is sort of it captures kind of this new view of the universe in a way that kids don't have a nature, because ultimately what Chesterton concludes is that little girls should have long hair. That's what you start with. That's concrete and is really particular. And if they get lice in their hair, it's because their mother is forced to go to the factory and doesn't have time to wash her hair. So you make sure that she doesn't have to go to the factory, and then that leads to this sort of whole series of changes, which ends up turning over the entire world. It causes like this complete reordering of the social order, but not one hair on this little girl's head is going to be touched. He concludes it's just a typically brilliant Chestertonian passage, but I think that's another way to kind of particularize our actions, is to start with these kinds of concretenesses. It's now 10:30. This has been, I think, just an absolutely illustrious panel and a fascinating discussion. I personally am ready to hop on a plane as long as they don't sort of force me to jump through too many hoops to do so, and join with all of you guys to have more sessions like this. Adam, I think this has been a terrific success. I hope that we can continue it and concretize these ideas and work maybe with a wider group at some point. But I won't twist anyone's arms to agree to that right away. I know all of you guys are busy people, and I just wanted to sort of wrap it up and say thanks.
Thank you. I think this has been a wonderful opportunity to exchange some interesting ideas. Hopefully there'll be more opportunities for discussion in different contexts. I think this was part of the original idea that this may spin off into other conversations. So we can certainly look at some possibilities for that. I think it's a timely set of issues and quite important.
Indeed. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. I'll let the techies take over from here. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thanks.
Bye.
See you.